Now for today's program. Dr. E.M. Rose, a historian of medieval and early modern Europe, is research associate at the Department of History at Harvard University and author of a forthcoming chapter on blood libels and crusades in the Cambridge History of Anti-Semitism. E.M. Rose's first book, The Murder of William of Norwich, The Origins of the Blood Libel in Medieval Europe, was named one of the 10 best history books of the year in 2015 by the Sunday Times of London and described by the Wall Street Journal as a landmark of historical research. It has been awarded the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize of the Phi Beta Kappa Society and the Albert C. Outler Award in Church History. A former journalist and television executive before returning to academia, Rose is currently engaged in a study of Jews in the histories of England. Please welcome Emily Rose.
Thank you so much, Moment, for inviting me to discuss my work, and thank you everyone for attending. I look forward to hearing your questions and for a lively discussion after I speak. So I don't have to tell everyone here why this is such a timely, newsworthy topic. As we know, all sorts of conspiracy theories have been circulating on the web and in social media, and many of them involve hateful things about Jews. Some of them that have to do with lasers and coronavirus sound new, but actually much of what is said and pictured is very familiar. We have seen it before in the social media of the distant past. And I'm now going to go to share screen so you can see some images. Okay. So at one time, it was thought that all this would disappear, that increasing education, knowledge, and information would help shine a bright light on dark corners. But that hasn't happened. Let me just hold on, let me show you. These vile rumors have just taken on a new life. They are stories about children, about medicine, and about evil Jews that we have seen in the past. And an outpouring of individual studies now look at various individual cases that are securely located in time and place, but they rarely address issues of origin. How did all this get started? The blood libel, the accusation that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood, is seared into the cultural memory of Europe. Yet not a single case can be shown to have happened. The blood libel is a lie. It is one of the most devastating and enduring lies ever told. In my book, The Murder of William of Norwich and the Origins of the Blood Libel in Medieval Europe, explains how the story was first fashioned in the High Middle Ages, and then it traces a few copycat cases that followed in the 12th century. So fake news goes back a long, long way. My book is about one of the most powerful and egregious examples of fake news that spread throughout Europe and lasted hundreds of years. It is a great lie told over and over. And I have to say, it isn't an easy subject and it doesn't make cheerful tea time conversation, but it continues to make headlines today. And it reads like fiction, even though it is history. So my book is a story within a story. It's a murder mystery told in a courtroom by people at the center of medieval urban life. So it's all too easy, as we have seen, to dismiss this as a marginal, wacko, and bizarre belief. The really scary thing is that it was not as bizarre and inexplicable as many historians suggest. It was rooted in conventional piety and local competition. And we need to understand that about what the other issues swirling around are. We can't always blame difficult things on an unnamed mob. We need to understand the circumstances in which identifiable individuals and institutions promote and endorse evil stories. Somebody leads the mob and points them in a particular direction. So what's the worst crime you can accuse someone of? bloodthirsty torture and murder. That is what is said of the Jews, that they commit bloodthirsty murder of little Christian boys in mockery of Christ and for secret rituals. Or later, that they bake blood into matzah. I'm going to show you some more images. Okay. Why isn't it going? So here are some enduring images from different centuries, and we're going to talk about the different things: the blood, the collecting, the surrounding, the pale innocence. So you have color issues, you have drinking and eating, you have you will see these tropes continue. And I know one of the advanced questions for this talk today was, how does this show up in white supremacy today? And you see some of these same pictures in modern imagery. So, but this is not just wackos. This spine-tingling tale has led to hundreds of pogroms, executions, and riots for almost 1,000 years, from the Middle Ages until today. Monuments memorializing this fake news dotted Europe. Enter the cathedral in Zaragoza, Spain, a World Heritage Site, and you will see a Baroque monument 3 stories high. Each year it is elaborately decorated for the annual celebration of the death of a child who never existed. Here in the building where the medieval kings of Aragon were crowned, one can gaze up at a shrine to Dominique, or in the diminutive Dominguito del Val, a boy said to have been killed by Jews 500 years earlier in 1250. Walk into the Cathedral of Lincoln, England, and you will see the remains of an elaborate funerary monument built by royal masons in the 13th century to recall little Hugh. Here, more than a century after Hugh supposedly died, the poet Geoffrey Chaucer pointed and recalled, "O young Hugh of Lincoln, slain also by cursed Jews." On the Middle Rhine, at another UNESCO World Heritage Site, you can see the imposing ruins of the 15th century chapel dedicated to Saint Werner that was erected in Bachrach. Werner was another young boy said to have been killed by Jews. And the Werner Kappel became a popular stop on the Grand Tour. Visit the Austrian Alps and drive up to the charming mountains of the Tyrol. Still today, one can visit the memorial to Andreas, or diminutively Anderl, of Rin. He was a boy abused and killed by his stepfather, a crime for which the Jews were blamed in the 15th century, and memorialized here in a painting 3 centuries later. And the whole question of Anderl of Rin is interesting because the bishop has tried very hard to end this cult, and neo-Nazis have come into town and insisted that they have an annual event. So you see there's a lot of competition around this particular cult. In France, Spain, England, Germany, Italy, Austria, Poland, and throughout Eastern Europe, there are such shrines and memorials. They commemorate alleged crimes that never happened. They tell stories invented years, sometimes hundreds of years, after the alleged events they memorialize. In many places, such monuments have been destroyed, taken down, covered up, or long forgotten. The Holy Innocents Church in Paris and its shrine to Richard of Pontoise stood for more than 500 years before it was taken down just before the French Revolution. So you can see the little tower on the right is the memorial to Richard of Pontoise. In some churches, such memorials remain out of sight, hard to see, and unrecognizable to the average churchgoer or visitors. In Sandomierz, Poland, a gory cycle of 18th century paintings was covered up. caught up in a dispute between those who want to remember and confront such images and those who would rather forget and move on. So long hidden behind a curtain, the painting cycle has recently been put back on display with a plaque explaining that Jews did not commit ritual murder. Yet, in Sandomierz, more than half the residents today persist in believing the story because they know that pictures of it exist, even though they haven't seen them. So this raises some interesting questions about what you do. Do you destroy monuments and commemorations of the past? Do you keep them up but have explanatory plaques? Do you take them out of churches and put them in museums? Or do you do what they've done in Sandomierz, which is now put them behind a curtain? So to repeat, the blood libel, this accusation that Jews killed Christian children, is seared into the cultural memory of Europe. But until now, no one who could agree how it got started. Those who have written about it, both Christians and Jews, have claimed that its origins are lost in the midst of time. But the charge does not go back to time immemorial. It does not even go back to biblical times. It is not lost in the midst of time. And it is not a charge, as many people think, that has been thrown at various groups at various times. At the turn of the century, the Jewish Encyclopedia was at great pains to suggest that it was not just targeted at Jews, and all these different groups had suffered from it. But actually, it goes back to the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, just a generation before Magna Carta, a period of castles, cathedrals, kings, and crusades. It is a story about people at the center of medieval life, not people living on the margins or the extremes, heights of power and money. It's average, everyday citizens going about their lives. People of conventional religiosity and traditional beliefs. It's your everyday people. If your knowledge of medieval England comes from Robin Hood, as many people tell me it does, that's fine. You've got exactly the right period. That film was set at the time of Richard the Lionheart and the Third Crusade. And my book starts a generation or so earlier, at a time when Richard's father, Henry, was a young man. It is exactly the time when the great romances of King Arthur and Robin Hood were composed. You know how those narratives have captured the public imagination ever since, just as the blood libel did, which was equally powerful in its time and beyond. Just like them, the narrative was recreated and reimagined in different generations. The story of its origin is a courtroom drama, a legal thriller with memorable, identifiable characters, which is not usable for the 12th century. Right after the disastrous failure of the Second Crusade, a knight comes back to Norwich, England, deeply in debt. He kills his Jewish banker and is put on trial because even in the Middle Ages, you can't go around killing your banker to expunge your debt, much as you would like to. So his lawyer invents a blame the victim defense. He argues that the court can't try the knight for killing the banker until he tries the banker and his entire Jewish community for killing someone else. You know, that Christian boy, young William, who died a few years ago. So he makes up the blood libel to get the guilty knight off the hook. So let me explain. The knight killed a Jewish banker and his lawyer had to blame someone else to get him off the hook. That's how the blood libel was first invented. That's why. so the question is, who is the legal defender? Who's the lawyer that comes up with this story? And the story is a mishmash. It relies on various things that were sort of known. It's not made out of whole cloth. It puts together stories about Jews getting together for a conference, about the Holy Innocents, the commentaries on New Testament actions, on stories of young Jesus. It's a quilt. It's an amalgamation of lots of things provoked by a trial where someone has to weave all this together. So who is the legal defender? Who's the guy that comes up with it? He is the local bishop. He is the feudal lord of the night, because that's what your lord does. Your lord defends you. But in this case, he is a religious man. He is a cleric. He's not a layman, but he is speaking in a layman's court, in a secular court. He defends his knight in front of the Curia Regis, the king's court. And he claims that the boy is a martyr and therefore a saint. He claims he was killed for his religion. And it is important to emphasize that he relies not on the Bible, neither the Hebrew Bible nor the New Testament, but on the biblical commentaries of the 12th century to make his point. So he's a very timely, he's quite au courant with the cultural aesthetic of the 12th century, of the High Middle Ages. And he puts this all together. And this is all written down at the time by a young monk. So the first part of my book is called The Monk, the Knight, the Bishop, and the Banker. And so the monk writes this down. He goes to court apparently and takes note. And he says it looked like, since everybody knew the knight was guilty, it looked like there was no defense. There was no way the bishop could get him off. But he was an experienced judge delegate. He was an experienced lawyer, and he left just enough question in the minds of the judges that the case was dismissed, sine die. It was thrown out of court because it was a time when the king, it was right after the Civil War, could not afford to offend his bishops. He could not afford to offend his knights. He could not afford to offend his Jews who were bankrolling. So the court that represent the king's court didn't know quite what to do, so they just threw it out. They left it up in the air. It was never actually decided. And therefore, it was available in the world. It was a story that was told. It wasn't clearly believed, but it was told, and it was never decided. There was never a judgment. It was never called out. So the second part of my book, The Earl, the Count, the Abbot, and the King, deals with 4 copycat incidents. There was one in Gloucester on the other side of the country, one in Bury St. Edmunds, probably a story told in competition with William's Shrine in Norwich, because Bury St. Edmunds and Norwich were in the same diocese. And then there were 2 across the channel in France. So I'm going to go back and show you. That is, these are pictures of Norwich Cathedral. And these are more pictures of Norwich, and these are all 12th century. This is what it would look like, the bridge from the 12th century. So we go to Paris. And this is also life in Paris at the time, which was the next one. So in each case, the plot, I'm going to show you, so okay. I'll come back to these slides in a minute. Sorry, I have to keep jumping back and forth between images. So in each case, the plot and characters are immediately recognizable. the innocent child playing ball, the distraught mother off looking for her offspring, the evil seducer, the stranger who lures the child away with sweet words. The story was retold with the same framework, but with different little details each time to give it local color and credibility. And so when I hear some of the stories today, the conspiracy stories, there are those same characters: the evil stranger, the seducer, the child who is lured away, and the torture. A lot of these elements are the same, but they are wrapped in a different package. So in the Middle Ages, the impulse was usually, but not only, financial. And those making and promulgating the charge, usually rulers, institutions, and specific identifiable groups, gained political and social advantage. The story was told with a purpose. In Norwich, it was told in a courtroom to help the knight. In Gloucester, it was told to pressure Jewish lenders for a military enterprise. So basically, a body of a child was laid out in the church, and it was suggested that this could be go viral. This much could be made of it, or the Jews could help lend money for the invasion of Ireland. And that seems to be what happened. And then the body disappears and there is no cult. So it seems to have been a pressure, a way to pressure Jewish lenders. In Blois, it was in France, in central France, it was told to reinforce the standing of the local ruler and make him seem powerful and independent by prosecuting bad guys in his small county. So if you're a sort of weak local count losing power, you look strong by prosecuting marginal people, and you look kingly, because that's one of the things kings do. They protect their populace, and they prosecute and burn people. And so that is the first time that Jews were actually burned in about 800 years. So in Paris, the story was first told as an excuse to kick the Jews out of the marketplace of Les Halles, where they lived. I'm going to go back to the slide now and show you. Share screen, PowerPoint. So here we see here we see a map of old Paris, and right where it says Les Champeaux, Les Halles, in the top, that's where the Jews were. And the Jews, we know that, the Jews were kicked out, and that's where the shrine to Richard of Pontoise was established. So there was a close relation between cleansing the city, expelling Jews on the grounds of ritual murder, and then building a shrine. Jews are actually allowed back into France 8 years later, but when they come back to the south side, a poorer area. They had to give up their valuable real estate. La Madeleine was where the Jewish synagogue had been. It's gone through lots of things now, but it's in the center of Paris. The Jews, when they came back, were moved to the outskirts. So there were all different purposes. Telling the blood libel is sometimes financial, but it's also about power and control and image by the people telling this and retelling this story. So as the story is retold, there are more and more serious repercussions. The result goes beyond extorting money, which is how it begins, to condemning Jews as heretics and burning the entire community to death. So attacking Jews was a way of attacking central authority, eliminating debts, demonstrating loyalty, and group solidarity. Each time the accusation was made, each case was rooted in local needs and local circumstances, political, financial, and social. But even when case after case was disproved, when, for example, Anderl's stepfather was blamed, when the Jews of Regensburg were repeatedly found not guilty by the courts, when the Count of Posen was found to have hidden a purported victim in the 16th century so that he would not have to pay his debts, when a young cleric blamed Jews for killing a girl he got pregnant in the 18th century, the story endured and remained immensely powerful. So I've showed you how pervasive it was, and I've told you how it got started. But how could it remain in the cultural memory long after individual cases were forgotten or dismissed? Seeing is believing. Viewing a static two-dimensional manuscript, a wall painting, or a cycle of paintings is persuasive. But seeing a story enacted, seeing that enactment every year, and taking part in that enactment and experiencing it time and again in different media is even more powerful. And here we have, this was a prayer, but I'm going to show you some other pictures. Here is a storybook. The Blood Libel was inculcated in the European cultural memory primarily through what I'm calling pediatric prejudice. The performance of saints' plays, the repetition of children's songs and folk ballads, and the reprinting of cartoons and nursery rhymes. So how can a society collectively remember something that didn't happen? It has long been argued that such fake news was a bottom-up phenomenon, spread by rumor among uneducated masses and punctuated by outbreaks of irrational mob violence. Alternatively, it has been said that it was a top-down phenomenon, spread in Latin texts by the educated elite and prompted primarily by theological or financial concerns. But there is a third possibility, that such beliefs were promulgated from the center, not by the highly educated, nor the uneducated, but by the semi-educated. They were spread not by studious written text, nor vague oral tradition, but by action and ritual and instruction. So here we have a storybook. Here we have multimedia examples. So this is an image on the right of Simon of Trent. It's on the cover of most of those books on blood libel that you've seen. But here it is in sculpture on the bottom left, in prints and broadsides that could be posted. That's a sculpture on the bottom right that was on a doorway. So there are all these different forms that were promulgated. So many of the techniques I'm going to go back here. Many of the techniques employed to promote the blood libel are those used today by modern advertising to create brand awareness: repetition, association, specific claims, and active involvement. Child saints, okay, so here are posters. This is another form of media. This was outside a church, but it's printed. So the whole question of distribution of these images, this is a 18th century cartoon. Here we have Saint Simon. Child saints were particularly held out as models for the young. Impressionable children were subjected to terrifying stories about evil adults who were out to get them, and fear made them certain to remember. So, like grown-ups, children saw pictures and heard sermons, but they also took part in saints' plays that inculcated memories of supposed Jewish perfidy. Here we have Werner. Many of these were school plays, informal, ad hoc, and therefore ephemeral texts. What began inside churches gradually moved outside of religious contexts into towns and taverns. The blood libel retained elements of these dramatic traditions while embracing burlesque and carnival. The ogre-eating children, the 17th century Kinderfresser shown here in the Marktplatz in Bern, recalls such attitudes. So you see the basis is the same, but it mutates. And I want to go back for a minute to Werner. I was reading about a rabbi, an American Reform rabbi, who wrote about his memories growing up in Oberwesel and said that he was beaten up in 1932 for having killed Saint Werner. Werner was a purported victim of Jewish blood libel, of ritual murder, but by the 18th century, he was sort of forgotten and at the Jewish aspect and became a saint of wine growers. But his memory was revived. And it turns out there were school plays of him, although as far as I know, none survive. At least I haven't seen a text of one. And so here, this is a sculpture in a Marktplatz. As much as viewing and acting out these gruesome stories, children heard and sang them from sheet music, like this version of the 1540 Sapfenfeld case, set to one of two, quote, popular and cheerful tunes that were well known to the general public. The ritual murder narrative was perpetuated through folk song, ballad, and rhyme in the local language. Werner's story was sung by poor school children as they begged for bread from door to door. Not only was there a play, but there was also a folk song about the blood libel of Endigen. In 1915, Fiddlin' John wrote a ballad about the death of Mary Fagin. This is the Leo Frank case. Even though Leo Frank was famously found not guilty in Atlanta, Georgia. He was lynched, as you know, in prison before he could be freed. But here we have pictures and a picture about the case. There have also been Hollywood movies since then. A ballad of Little Hugh of Lincoln, not medieval, but an early modern creation. Actually, it's an 18th century creation. It doesn't go back quite as late as we thought. Was sung in versions throughout England, Scotland, and Ireland. Multiple versions of that ballad were sung by American hillbillies in the Ozark Mountains. As a folk song, Little Hugh has been professionally recorded at least 18 times in the past generation or two in America. So the role of, here we have another picture of the ballad. The role of children has not been adequately appreciated in the promulgation of this horrific lie, this fake news. They were both the object and subject of the blood libel narrative. Young clerks in particular, and then adolescent boys in general, were encouraged to see themselves as Christ-like victims of the blood libel, and this does go back to the 12th century. They were thus placed in the grand epic of salvation history and encouraged to imagine themselves in the role of martyr. Their mothers were likewise encouraged to see themselves as types of the sorrowing Virgin Mary. Even today, Dominique Delval is shown with his chorister robe and his crucifixion-like wounds. He is held out as a role model for altar servers to identify with his suffering. A suffering that never happened, and a child who never existed. So, in conclusion, in much the same way that military victories, recalled with fireworks and parades and children dressing up, served and still serve today as bonding elements, evocations of national identity and civic rituals of inclusion, so too over past centuries, images of the purported victims of ritual murder serve to bond communities, enhance identity, and enforce exclusion. Narratives of such alleged events were taught on numerous small and local occasions to impressionable young children. They appeared in print, not in heavy, imposing tomes, but in ephemeral works, postcards and tourist brochures, and were encountered in short visits to alleged sites, in songs and in school plays. In considering the construction of cultural memory, it is common to focus on the big, the important, and the monumental, and overlook the small, the incremental and the fleeting. The blood libel was not haphazardly recalled, but inculcated in a variety of media by different means. It was taught in the nursery, at the hearth, and on the schoolyard. Long after the blood libel supposedly disappeared because of the so-called desacralization of the world, the narrative lived on. It was perpetuated in souvenir postcards, in cartoons, and in nursery rhymes, and at tourist sites. We know about some of these, but in many more cases, no pictures have survived. And I show you here some postcards, and I think, who would have sent these postcards and why? What was going on? So it's not just the information. You've often, I'm sure, have seen these pictures, but it often isn't made clear exactly what media, what form this transmission of and circulation of knowledge takes place. So these are postcards. This is like wish you were here. When we think about the persistence and dissemination of such accounts of hatred today, we must focus on the enduring power of popular culture, children's literature, and ephemeral works on paper. That is the primary locus where collective memory events of this type were and are lodged, and how they continue to be promulgated. So I'm going to come back. We have to be aware of how fake news is spread and who is susceptible, how fear is a powerful tool for searing something in the collective memory, how small stories once told for a fleeting and unimportant event in a local conflict can spiral out of control. So William of Norwich, to go back to where I began, a young boy out on a spring day in a provincial English town, became the touchstone for fake news that has lasted for centuries. So debunk the myth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that very informative presentation. We have lots and lots of questions, and so we'll get to as many as we can. Again, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box. We'll start off. I've got two here that I'm going to put together. How are the historic blood libel beliefs manifested in white nationalism and other types of anti-Semitism today, consciously and subconsciously? And also, is there a direct line from blood libel to QAnon?
There's a lot of debate about whether there's a direct line. What I would say is the imagery is very similar, and some of the tropes, the phrases. So for some people it's not the same, for some it is. I don't study modern nationalist I mean, I'm a citizen and a newsreader, but I don't study the white supremacist movement. But I can say, as just reading the newspapers, I look at the charges and they are so familiar. And as I said, they involve spreading disease, they involve seducing children, they involve a world conspiracy, and they involve blood. So it all rings familiar. There is a continuous line. Whether there is a direct line is debatable.
Thank you. A very good question about the artists who did the paintings and the sculptures. What is known about them? What motivated them? Were they commissioned?
That is, they were commissioned. They work in a tradition of representations of Christ. I am working on a study, among other things, on representations of blood libel. And so the text says basically the same thing, but where the knife is held in these images tells you about the interpretation, which is when it's held at the genitals, it relates to circumcision, and this was a very big issue in the 15th century and recalls the circumcision of Christ, which at that time was believed to be the first shedding of his blood. Interestingly, by the 17th century, this is not an issue for Christian theological reasons. The knife is held at the neck, and that's supposed to recall temple sacrifice. In the 19th century, that's really important. It's kosher. It's about debates on kosher butchering and animal husbandry in the 19th century. In the earlier centuries, it's held at the chest, and that has to do with the Lamb of God. So the imagery can suggest what parallels there are. The artists themselves, by and large, they're not great works of art. They are not specified in the commission. These are artisans, workaday artists. They are doing a lot of other things. They don't seem to be people specializing in anti-Semitism, but they may specialize in the media. So small sculptures or doorways or this, but I think we don't know very much about art. We know about some of the manuscript stuff, some of the gorgeous art, but much of the stuff I'm talking about, I wouldn't say is great art. It's influential, but it's not great.
Thank you. Has the Catholic Church and popes ever spoken out about the blood libel hoaxes?
The church has spoken out repeatedly and emphatically. Not every pope, I have to say, but most popes. And one of the big issues is they spoke out about individual cases. So when particular cases were brought to their attention or whatever. And in the 13th century, they would say bishops would reiterate this, and some archbishops. But in the 1930s, when Jews wanted the popes to reissue and make broad claims against this, they didn't. So, and in the 1890s, the House organ did not. But generally, popes have actually spoken out at length about this.
Thank you. Is there a connection between the medieval blood libel and what Josephus writes in Against I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yes. Anti-Appian, contra Appionem.
Right, and is relating to the accusation that Jews fatten non-Jewish people in their temple for the purpose of sacrifice.
So it was thought, remember I said at the beginning that in the 19th century, late 19th century, Jews wanted to say that this was a charge thrown by lots of people at lots of times, and then it goes way back in time. The contra Appionem accusation is well known. I think Gavin Langmuir showed pretty clearly that it has no connection to the modern charge. So I would say no. Some people think so, but I don't think there's a direct connection, no.
Okay, this is interesting. Someone says in the 70s and 80s, Greek friends of theirs told them how when they were growing up in the 60s, in the weeks leading up to Easter, their grandmothers warned them not to stray far from home, lest the Jews get them. They took Christian boys and put them in barrels with nails to kill them and use the blood for matzah. Just wondering if you know of other places where the blood libel is alive and disseminated.
So actually, the question of the Jew in the barrel is a real interest of mine. It is different from the blood libel I've just discussed, or it only shows up in the 17th century. And very much it's in Russia, Poland, and Italy. It is not a phenomenon of Western Europe. I think it has to do with the revival. There is a famous Roman general who was put in, I think it's Marcus Attilius, who was put, not Jewish, nothing to do with Jews, put in a barrel. And I think it is a revival of that story in the 17th century. So that putting someone in a spiked barrel has its own tradition that is not a religious one, and conflates with this long more religiously oriented blood libel. The end of the question was modern places where it exists. I think that's well documented. It has gone into the Arab world. It exists on the margins of various places, and I believe QAnon is one of those places. But I don't really do modern stuff. But yes, it pops up, and friends are always sending me links and news articles about where it has shown up. So yes, that's a whole nother lecture of the modern day.
Thank you. I know we're talking about the origins of the blood libel, but somebody had a question about, has your studies and research ever given you any insight into what would have been the very origin of hatred of Jews and Judaism? When were the very first instances that allowed it to grow? And I'll combine that with somebody else's question about the binding of Isaac, and would that be an origin of blaming Jews for the killing of Jews?
So a lot of people have looked for a long time, both Christians and Jews, into Jewish tradition and Jewish texts to explain the origins. So whether it's putting blood into matzah, whether it is misunderstanding the red wine of Passover, whether it is circumcision al peh, there are lots of Jewish behaviors and also Jewish texts like the binding of Isaac that have been called in to explain the blood libel. And I would say none of that holds up under scrutiny. That the closest thing that we are all looking at now that I highlight in my book is the Holy Innocents, which is the medieval interpretation of a New Testament story that Herod killed children, Jewish children, while looking for the Christ child. And there is, although that cult goes back a very long way, there is a revival and reinterpretation in the High Middle Ages. These are holy innocents. That's their capital H, capital I. And the blood libel ritual murder accusation grows very much with that cult. And pictures of purported victims are portrayed in or described in, or they use the liturgy for the Holy Innocents. And this is why these, in a number of churches that have put up plaques for the blood libel, they say, oh, these were innocents. And I think they don't understand that in and of itself, by using the term innocent and capitalizing it, actually goes back to the very formation of the libel. So the Abrahamic, the Isaac question, it's, it may be lurking in the background, but I think there is not a connection, not as close as some of the others.
Thank you. Since we're in a pandemic now, I wonder if you have thoughts about the fate of the Jews in the Black Plague and any relationship with blood libel.
Absolutely. The more work we do, the Black Death absolutely decimated means cut a tenth, destroyed Jewish communities, and was so much worse than anything that went before or after, I think, in terms of number. And a lot of communities we only know about because of the Black Death, the plague of 1348 to 50. So the first thing is when there's a pandemic and people are scared, they try to find explanations and they turn on anyone who is foreign or different. And it's pretty clear that in some cases, if Jews were sicker than others, obviously they spread it. If they weren't sicker as others, they obviously spread it. They were blamed for a lot. But I would look at the other side too. We know all these communities, many of these communities, because they were destroyed, which suggests that there were hundreds of years and hundreds of communities that existed perfectly well, living together peacefully with no news until something bad happened. So I think when bad things happen, you tend to look for, you tend to lash out, but also that's what gets in the news. I don't know if I answered the entire question, but.
Thank you. Can you give us some examples of how the term blood libel has been used or misused or misappropriated recently in social media and beyond?
I think everyone knows that blood libel is a horrible thing to accuse anyone of. And so it is a term that is thrown around all the time. I think the most well-known case is when Sarah Palin used the term blood libel. And I got lots of calls. Did she use it right? Did she use it wrong? As I recall, Shmuley Boteach wrote an op-ed in, I believe, the Wall Street Journal saying she didn't misuse it. Other people said it was outrageous. What I took away from it is everybody knows the term. It's a horrible, powerful term to invoke, and many people are not clear on what it means. So I could give you tons and tons of examples of people using it. I don't get into whether it's right or wrong. What I think is clear is how powerful a term it is. And therefore, people rope it in to anything that may or may not be related.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And are there any instances in the United States when there was accusations of blood libel?
So there are very few. The most well-known case is Leo Frank, who was accused in Atlanta of killing Mary Fagan. And it's a fascinating case. It's been treated a lot in movies and books. He was lynched. So although he was found not guilty, he was lynched by the KKK. That's the most famous case. It was a result of that, I believe, that B'nai B'rith was founded. The most well-known case in recent times has been the Messina case in upstate New York, about which there is a new book. It was one of the books I put up, which supposedly played a role or came about right at a presidential election. So I think there are some parallels with the political mood today. But to me, the biggest takeaway of that case is that it had absolutely no staying power. A little girl was lost. The police investigated. Someone suggested that maybe the Jews took her. They went to the rabbi. Local rabbi said that's absurd. And she was found asleep the following day. So some people want to take that as an enduring example of horrible anti-Semitism, hundreds of years. I take it as quite the opposite. It was a, 48-hour or less wonder. It was thoroughly denounced. There were apologies. It was in the newspaper, and most people don't remember it and had to be reminded. So some cases blow up out of all proportion, like Hugh of Lincoln, which was less important at the time than in the hundreds of years past. But the Messina case, I think, was one where it was forgotten, and it's only now that we've revived it. But the lesson there is it could be squelched and denounced.
Great, thank you. This is interesting. Is there anything about modern America today that reminds you of medieval Europe?
Where to begin? It's much more medieval than medieval Europe. A lot of what we think is medieval is constructed because we are trying to say this is modern and that's medieval. So, in the movie, when they say, I'm going to get medieval on your ass, we all know what that means. But in fact, that's early modern. So as medievalist, I would say early modern with the revived use of Roman law and torture was probably a lot worse than the Middle Ages. Most of the cases of blood libel, there were far more cases of blood libel in the very late medieval, early modern period than in the high Middle Ages, when it's supposedly a medieval accusation, and way more in the late 19th century and turn of the 20th century. So this is something that you want to attribute to the deep, dark past, but it isn't. I would say the biggest parallel just in general is the use of visual media, imagery. So whether it's Instagram posts or Facebook or whatever, and visual works different than textual. I know I can't read all the questions that are coming in while I'm answering, but I know a lot of them are about imagery and what are the connections. And so I would say with all these modern conspiracies, they're not just dog whistles, there are dog pictures. So one of the questions that I glanced at while I was talking was, what about the Kinderfresser and the eating? So the eating and drinking, the cutting up, that is an image. The plate, the drink, the collecting, that goes way back, and that appears in modern imagery of the conspiracy stuff we've discussed.
Thank you. We are quickly running out of time. So unfortunately, we're only going to get to one more question, though it's been asked multiple times in terms of what can we do? What can average citizens do to help stop the spread of the blood libel? And how do we approach this?
I think one thing is to recognize, I get that a lot, and it's hard. I think shine the light on it, recognize the tropes, the imagery, and call it out. The blood, it isn't innocuous, or it can lie low and then it can blow up. So I think acknowledging and recognizing what those, I guess, dog whistles are, or what those images are that are meant to appeal to conspiracy theorists, and shine a light on them and denounce them specifically. That is not everyone who uses or invokes them is anti-Semitic or understands them. So I think we have to begin by showing this is what it recalls or is meant to recall. And while you may not, the speaker may not know that, other people do, and it appeals to them. So I think we don't have to charge in and say, this is outrageous, you are being medieval, but you can say this has overtones that are very problematic.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you spending the time and really shining a light on this, which I know so many people are interested in today. I want to thank everybody for coming and remind you to sign up for next week's session, where we will have a play reading of Hitler's Tasters. Just letting you know, it will be a 90-minute session so that we have time to see some of the excerpts from the play, as well as hear from the playwright, Michelle Coholis Brooks. Also, please don't forget to go to Moment's website at momentmag.com, where you can sign up for our anti-Semitism monitor, and you can subscribe to the magazine and read a variety of articles. We also have a nice review of Emily's book on our website. Be sure to go to your local bookstore and purchase that book. We will be sending out a follow-up email, and we'll include a link to that as well. And if you've enjoyed our program, we hope that you'll consider making a donation to help us continue this programming. Again, thank you very much, Emily, and we'll see everybody next time.